Think about that sentence for just a moment. How would you finish that sentence? If I ruled the world. If I ruled the world, there would be no more hunger. If I ruled the world, everyone would have access to clean water. If I ruled the world, there would be no more war. After a while, we might start to sound like Miss America contestants, right? Now, none of us in this room believes we'll ever be in a position to rule the world. So when we make these statements, we know that we're sort of just exaggerating, expressing our desire for the way we think the world should work. No, none of us in here will ever be kings or queens, presidents or dictators, but we do the best we can to effect change in our own little neck of the woods. So sometimes our thinking doesn't have to be on quite such a large scale. Maybe it sounds a little more like this. You know, if I were in charge at work, things would be run the right way. If I raised my grandkids, they'd be raised the right way. If I ran things at that church, we'd do it the way we did it at our old church. That sounds a little more like us, doesn't it? But then there are times when we see tragedy strike. We see injustice take root, and we see the innocent destroyed and the guilty go free. And we think, if I were God. Our righteous anger in the face of violence and pain and suffering leads us to a place where we wish that we could take over, where we could bring justice to those who seek to harm the vulnerable in our midst. Think way back to 9/11 and how you felt that day. In addition to sadness, we felt an outrage and an anger, didn't we? In fact, some of us felt a rage kind of build inside of us that we didn't even realize we were capable of feeling. We have to go get those people. I mean, we may not have all vocalized that, but most of us were bent toward that inclination. And if we're honest with ourselves, the day the bombs began to drop in the Middle East, we felt justified. There are many things in this world on a daily basis that enrage us. Many things that happen that call us to cry out, something must be done. You know, I think to myself, if I were God, anyone who ever traffics a child into slavery would just be annihilated. If I were God, anyone who harms or tortures an animal would experience that same pain. If I were God, there would be no more mass shootings. And the minute anybody even thought about it, I would just destroy him. Just take her off the face of the planet. And the list goes on and on. You see, all of this feeds into a very human instinct that we possess. Get your enemies. Judge violence with violence. And then there will be peace. This cycle has gone on from the beginning of time. From the Assyrians to the Babylonians to the Israelites to Alexander the Great to the great Roman Empire. And the amazing thing about this cycle of violence is that each and every one of these nations and societies believed to some extent that they were judging their enemies in the name of and under the blessing of their God. As I've shared with some of you, particularly those of you in my Monday classes, I've become really interested in all of these TV shows that are out right now that dramatize the development of the world in the 4th and 5th centuries. There are shows about Vikings that are trying to take over Britain. And because it's told from the Vikings' perspective, you kind of feel yourself rooting for the Vikings a little bit. And then there are shows about the kings of Britain trying to defend their kingdoms against the Vikings, and because it's told from their perspective, you sort of pull for the Brits. And then, of course, there are shows about Celtic tribes fighting against other Celtic tribes, and the Roman Empire coming in and trying to co-opt those tribes for their own agenda. But one thing remains the same. No matter who the good guy is or who the bad guy is, they all share one thing in common. They believe that their cause is just. They believe that violence is the means to power. And in each of these societies, religion plays a huge role in that desire. What this reveals to us is this: we have always believed that God was a warrior. We have always believed that God maintains power through control and through violence. But then we get to Friday, and all of a sudden our vision of God no longer makes sense. Jesus, you were supposed to be the one who would free us from our enemies. Jesus, you were supposed to be the one who would start the revolt. We have soldiers and rebels and zealots just waiting for your command. We are ready to die for Israel. We are ready to kill in your name. It was almost as if for 3 years they had tuned out the words of Jesus, words like, love your enemies, bless those who persecute you, and turn the other cheek. But then they get to Friday. Peter himself, the night before, resorted to violence to try to save Jesus by cutting off the ear of one of the arresters. Jesus rebukes Peter and says, put away your sword. And then he stoops down and he heals one of his very arresters. Instead of righteous anger and violent justice that his followers wanted to see, they instead get to Friday. And they look at the cross and they see the King of the Jews bloodied and beaten and suffocating. If you really are God, save yourself. The people cried out for Jesus to save himself because, well, that's exactly what we would have done. After all, how does a bruised and beaten Jew defeat the Roman Empire? How does a man who teaches nonviolence expect to defeat our oppressors? And as they watched Jesus breathe his last, they may have even said, I guess he wasn't who we thought he was. Because if he were, it would be the Romans up there on that cross and not him. See, on the surface of Good Friday, all that anyone could see was just one of 1,000 Jewish criminals being executed by the Romans. Just another victim of the Roman oppression. Just one more reason to be angry and to want the heads of the Romans. Certainly, this couldn't be the plan of God. It's foolish. It's weak. And there it is. We just heard the words of Paul. For the foolishness of God is wiser than human wisdom, and the weakness of God is stronger than human strength. It seems foolish that the way by which God would gain power and victory over the kingdom of darkness would be by allowing the kingdom of darkness to kill him. It seems foolish that by allowing humans to commit atrocious violence upon Jesus, that God would be outpouring a scandalous love upon all of humanity. It seems foolish that by taking the sin of the world on himself, God was defeating that very same sin and shame. It seems foolish that true power is in appearing weak. It seems foolish that true holiness comes by appearing to be a guilty criminal. It seems foolish that violence and war and sin and death would be overcome by love, even a love for one's own enemies. My friends, this is the foolishness of the cross. It is the foolishness of Friday. Paul writes that if the powers of darkness had known that the crucifixion of Christ would be their own undoing, they never would have put the Son of God to death. But in a kingdom that is ruled by violence and darkness seem to be the only way to gain power. But in God's kingdom ruled by grace and truth, only love can break through to show us what real power looks like. The foolishness of Friday tells us this: that God's ways are not our ways. That what makes sense to us is often upside down and in contrast to the wisdom of God. And that God utilizes weakness to display true strength and pain to bring new life. Some of you have been carrying a nail with you that you received at your Ash Wednesday service. You've had it in your pocket or your purse. If so, I hope you brought that with you today. If you don't have a nail, there are nails that will be available up front here at the cross. And in just a few moments, you're going to have the opportunity to use that nail in a time of reflection and as a declaration of trust in God. But before we enter into that time of reflection, I want you to take a moment to think and pray about the things that are going on in your life today. Are you going through something that makes you feel weak and powerless, that seems hopeless and perhaps even foolish? Have you received a devastating diagnosis? Is your marriage crumbling? Are your finances in peril? Are you experiencing depression or substance abuse and addiction? Whatever it may be, I want you to place that onto that nail. Because if God can take all of the sin in the world, and if God's very own death can bring life to the entire universe, then I promise you that God can take whatever death it is that you are currently dying and use that to bring life to you. It may seem foolish to you, but in the wisdom of God, all sickness and pain and tragedy can be used to bring new life and new redemption into your life. All you need to do is trust. You need to look at this cross. Yes, there is what appears to be a God-forsaken criminal on that cross. But when you can look behind the scenes, you can see what God is up to. That behind this God-forsaken criminal, God is pouring out salvation onto the entire world. With those same eyes of faith that see God behind this cross, you can look below the surface of whatever pain and death you are experiencing, and you can see God at work, bringing redemption and salvation to you. All it takes is a little faith and a little trust. It does not mean that your pain isn't real, but what it does mean is that you're not alone in your pain, and that your pain is filled with a purpose. Remember that what seems hopeless and foolish and weak to you is the strength and wisdom of God at work. And so whenever you're ready, in this time of reflection, you're invited to come forward, to take whatever it is that seems weak and hopeless in your life and to nail it into this cross as a declaration of faith and hope that God is doing something behind the scenes. And what God is doing is bringing you life and love and redemption and salvation, even through the darkness, the death, and the foolishness of our pain. Whenever you are ready, you are welcome to come forward to the cross and in an act of declaration of faith, give over that foolishness to God and take from God the strength and wisdom that the Spirit has promised us.